Mr. Johnson noticed the foxes behaving strangely near his farm, appearing restless and frequenting his property more than usual. They seemed determined to get his attention, often interrupting his morning chores. When one stared directly at him, its eyes pleading, he began to wonder what they wanted. Curiosity nagged him all day, compelling him to think there might be something more to their persistence. He decided to pay closer attention, hoping to uncover the mystery behind their odd behavior. Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that the foxes were trying to show him something important. Despite initially dismissing the foxes' odd behavior, they became hard to ignore. Every morning they would approach Mr. Johnson during his chores, almost as if they were trying to tell him something. Whether he was feeding the chickens or fixing a fence, there was always a fox lurking nearby, watching him closely. Their persistent interruptions started getting under his skin, making him more curious about their intentions. Clearly, they wanted his attention for a reason. One particular morning, Mr. Johnson was feeding the pigs when a fox stood just a few feet away, staring right at him. Its eyes were nearly pleading, giving him a feeling of unease. It was as if the fox was trying to communicate, wanting him to understand something. This wasn't typical behavior for a wild animal, and it gnawed at Mr. Johnson's mind. He began to ponder what they wanted to convey. Despite trying to brush it off, the image of that fox staring at him stayed with Mr. Johnson all day. As he went about his tasks, thoughts of the unusual behavior kept creeping back into his mind. He found himself repeatedly glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see those eyes watching him. The more he thought about it, the more he felt there was something he was missing. His curiosity was definitely piqued. Driven by growing curiosity, Mr. Johnson made a conscious decision to pay closer attention to the foxes around his farm. He started watching their movements more closely, trying to decipher any patterns or clues in their behavior. This wasn't just mindless wandering. The foxes seemed purposeful in their actions. Determined to get to the bottom of this, he began to follow their activities more intently, hoping to understand what they were trying to convey. Mr. Johnson's suspicions were confirmed when he noticed the foxes becoming even more restless and persistent. They appeared not just in the mornings, but throughout the day, making their presence known. Whether he was out in the fields or working in the barn, there they were, darting around and yipping with increased urgency. It was as if they were running out of time. He felt an uneasy urgency himself, realizing he needed to figure this out soon. Mr. Johnson started connecting dots when he remembered that some of his chickens had gone missing recently. Additionally, he noticed a few fences that appeared tampered with, but not in a way that wild animals typically would. This unexplained and neat damage seemed suspicious. These incidents began to align with the fox's strange behavior, making him even more determined to find out what was really going on. His mind raced with possibilities. He began to wonder if the foxes were responsible for the missing chickens and tampered fences. However, he had doubts. The damage seemed far too neat and precise for wild animals. Most of the time, they acted out of desperation or hunger, leaving a mess behind. This was different. His skepticism grew, but so did his resolve to solve this mystery. He needed more information to draw any solid conclusions. Hoping for some clarity, Mr. Johnson decided to discuss the odd behavior with his neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins. "Have you noticed anything unusual with the foxes around here?" he asked her one afternoon. She shrugged and answered, "Wild animals act weird all the time, nothing to worry about." Her casual dismissal did little to ease his mind. Despite her reassurance, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. Even after talking with Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Johnson's curiosity remained piqued. He decided it wasn't enough to simply dismiss the fox's behavior as random. "I'm going to keep a closer eye on them," he said to himself. He started noting down instances of their peculiar actions, tracking their movements, and trying to figure out any form of a pattern. The foxes had clearly become a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. Mr. Johnson promised himself to keep a vigilant eye on the foxes moving forward. Their mysterious actions had woven a seed of curiosity in his mind. He decided that ignoring the animals wasn't an option anymore. Tracking their movements became a part of his daily routine. Every time he noticed one, he'd take mental notes of their behavior. He was determined to uncover whatever message they were trying to convey. As Mr. Johnson recalled recent occurrences around the farm, the small disturbances began to seem too suspicious to ignore. Missing chickens and tampered fences now bothered him even more. He could no longer chalk these incidents up to mere coincidences. His instincts told him the foxes had something to do with it. This notion only deepened his resolve to pay closer attention to their increasingly strange behavior, adding to his growing list of questions. Over the next few days, the fox's actions became even more intense. It wasn't just one or two appearances, they were there multiple times a day. Morning, noon, or night, their presence was constant. Mr. Johnson noticed them at every turn as though their urgency had escalated. The heightened activity made him more determined to observe them closely and comprehend their objective. His curiosity grew with every passing moment. The foxes began to show up even during Mr. Johnson's heavy machinery work, proving their persistence. While he operated tractors and other equipment, they would dart around the fields, catching his eye. He had to be extremely cautious, not wanting to harm them by accident. Their frequent appearances were becoming harder to ignore. He couldn't dismiss it as random anymore. They were obviously trying to get his attention for a specific purpose. One morning, as Mr. Johnson was loading hay onto his tractor, a fox stood directly in his path until he stopped the engine. The audacity of the animal startled him. He wasn't used to wild creatures daring to come so close. Shutting off the engine, he watched as the fox stood its ground, fixing its gaze on him. It was like a silent plea for him to follow or pay extra attention to something. Realizing it wasn't just one, but several foxes trying to get his attention was a turning point for Mr. Johnson. Their coordinated effort indicated a more serious intention behind their actions. He began thinking that maybe these foxes were collectively working toward showing him something. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a well-orchestrated attempt to communicate. This revelation intrigued and confused him equally, urging him to observe more closely than ever before. Confused but intrigued, Mr. Johnson began to observe the foxes more closely than ever before. Their every move was now under his scrutiny. Anytime they appeared, he would stop what he was doing to watch them. He noted their patterns, timings, and behaviors, seeking any clue that could explain their persistence. His farm duties took a back seat. Understanding the fox's motive became his priority. Every day brought new observations that deepened his curiosity. Mr. Johnson wondered about the fox's coordinated efforts aimed towards him. Their actions seemed purposeful, almost deliberate. What could be so important that wild animals would work together in such an unusual manner? This question haunted him, making him even more resolute in his observations. He needed answers, and he felt he was getting closer with every passing day. The puzzle pieces were there, he just had to fit them together. On a particularly rainy evening, Mr. Johnson spotted a fox on his porch. It was drenched and shivering, looking utterly pathetic. He felt a pang of sympathy for the poor creature. Despite the rain soaking him as well, he stepped outside, taking pity on the fox. It was different from previous encounters, appearing more vulnerable. This unusual behavior pulled at his heartstrings, making him even more committed to understanding what they were trying to tell him. Taking pity, Mr. Johnson threw the drenched fox a piece of leftover meat. The animal devoured it quickly, clearly starving. But unlike what he expected, the fox didn't leave after eating. Instead, it sat there, staring at him, almost as if waiting for something more. This persistent behavior struck him deeply. He could no longer dismiss them as mere nuisances. He felt a heavy sense of responsibility to figure out what the foxes wanted. The fox didn't leave, but instead sat there, staring at Mr. Johnson expectantly. Its eyes seemed to be asking him for something. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew it wasn't just about the food. The persistence of this particular fox started to wear on him. He continued to watch it, his curiosity heightening with each passing moment. The encounter left him feeling more puzzled than ever. The fox's persistence began to wear on Mr. Johnson, making him feel as though something deeper was at play. He couldn't shake the sense that these animals were trying to communicate something vital to him. The constant presence of the foxes lingered in his thoughts, gnawing at his curiosity. Every time he saw them, his feeling that there was more to the story grew stronger. He was perplexed but determined. Maybe you should just ignore them, his wife suggested one evening as they sat down for dinner. Mr. Johnson shook his head. I don't think I can. There's something odd going on, he replied, pushing his food around on his plate. He couldn't shake the feeling that these foxes were trying to tell him something important. Ignoring them wasn't an option. His curiosity had taken hold completely. Determined to understand the fox's peculiar behavior, Mr. Johnson decided to continue paying attention. He couldn't dismiss them as mere nuisances any longer. Every time they appeared, he noted their behavior carefully. The pieces of this puzzle were starting to come together, albeit slowly. He felt a strong urge to uncover the message they seemed so desperate to convey. This renewed commitment spurred him into action, making him even more vigilant. That weekend, Mr. Johnson noticed something strange. Early in the morning, he found his farm gate left open. He was sure he had closed it properly the night before. and the unsettling discovery caught his attention immediately. Surveying the area, he wondered if this incident was connected to the foxes. His mind began racing with questions. The open gate was yet another anomaly he couldn't ignore. Convinced he had closed the gate properly the night before, Mr. Johnson started surveying the area. He walked around the perimeter, looking for any signs of disturbance. He observed the ground closely for any clues. Every unusual marker he spotted added to his growing suspicion. He was determined to find out what had really happened, knowing that this was yet another piece of the ongoing mystery. As he surveyed the area, he noticed more fox tracks than usual around the gate. It was as if they had been pacing back and forth in those spots. These tracks indicated a higher activity level among the foxes, which only fueled his curiosity further. The marks on the ground seemed more frantic and hurried than before. This newfound detail urged him to pay even closer attention to upcoming encounters. The foxes appeared more agitated, darting around the perimeter of his farm. They moved quickly, almost frenetically, as if something was amiss. Mr. Johnson couldn't help but notice their heightened state of agitation. His observations confirmed that their recent behavior wasn't ordinary. Their energy and actions spoke volumes, suggesting an escalating situation. This behavior convinced him that something significant was at play, urging him to follow their lead even more closely. Now, certain that something was amiss, Mr. Johnson made a decision. The next time the foxes approached him, he would follow them to see where they led. He felt a strong need to uncover the reason behind their persistent behavior. The anticipation and curiosity were too intense to ignore. His mind was set. He was ready to get to the bottom of the mystery surrounding these foxes and their intentions. Mr. Johnson's resolve to uncover what the foxes wanted grew stronger with each passing day. Their relentless attempts to get his attention couldn't be ignored any longer. He prepared himself mentally for what might lie ahead. Whatever the foxes were trying to show him, he was determined to find out. Observing them had become a crucial part of his daily routine. The mystery intrigued him more than ever. The following day, the foxes returned with even more urgency. Mr. Johnson noticed it right away. Their yips were louder and their movements more frantic. It was clear that something had escalated. They seemed desperate to get his attention, almost as if they were running out of time. Whatever was happening, it appeared to be reaching a critical point. Mr. Johnson braced himself for whatever he might find. They yipped and ran back and forth on his porch, clearly trying to beckon him. Their eyes were focused on him, giving him no room to doubt their intentions. It was almost as if they were saying, "Follow us now." Their persistent, frantic behavior left him no choice. Setting aside his morning tasks, Mr. Johnson made a quick decision to follow them. Today was the day he'd get to the bottom of it. Determined, Mr. Johnson grabbed his coat and decided to follow the foxes. He wasn't sure what he would find, but his curiosity and sense of urgency pushed him to act. He took a deep breath and locked the farmhouse door behind him. With a resolute pace, he started following them into the nearby woods. Each step he took felt like he was one step closer to unraveling the mystery. The foxes led him through an unfamiliar, twisting path that he barely recognized. The woods grew denser and the underbrush tangled around his boots. Following the foxes became increasingly challenging as they darted through narrow trails and leaped over fallen branches. Mr. Johnson's eyes strained to keep them in sight. Despite the difficult terrain, he was resolute, determined to see where this odd journey would lead him. The eerie atmosphere and distant woodland sounds followed him as he kept pace with the foxes. Every rustle and crackle seemed amplified in the silence of the evening forest. Mr. Johnson could hear the calls of nocturnal creatures preparing for their nightly activities. The combination of sights and sounds made the woods feel alive in a different way. Though unnerved, he was too committed to let fear deter him. The thick forest canopy above darkened the path as the sun began to set. Shafts of dwindling sunlight barely pierced through the leaves, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the ground. Mr. Johnson squinted, trying to keep track of the flickering forms of the foxes ahead. He could feel a drop in temperature as the day's warmth escaped through the gaps in the trees. His resolve remained firm. He wouldn't turn back now. The trail became steeper, leading them to a rocky, treacherous part of the woods. Mr. Johnson found himself carefully navigating over jagged rocks and loose soil. Each step required caution, making progress slow but steady. The foxes, agile and sure-footed, moved gracefully ahead of him. Despite the increasing difficulty, he pressed on, driven by the desire to uncover whatever secret lay at the end of this path. As he navigated the difficult terrain, thoughts of turning back crossed Mr. Johnson's mind. The path was becoming more treacherous and doubt began to seep in, but each time he considered retreating, the foxes looked back as urging him to continue. Ignoring his growing apprehension, he pressed on. The mystery pulled him forward, a magnet for his curiosity. He knew he couldn't turn back now, not after coming this far. The foxes suddenly stopped and looked back at him as if checking to make sure he was still with them. Their eyes shone with a strange, knowing light, almost reassuring him to keep moving. Mr. Johnson paused to catch his breath, contemplating the unspoken communication happening between them. He nodded to himself, convinced more than ever that they were leading him somewhere important. Taking another step, he followed them onward. They continued along a narrow deer trail, and Mr. Johnson noticed broken branches and signs of human activity. This remote part of the woods wasn't often visited by others, which heightened his curiosity. Unease began to bubble up who could be out here. Each broken twig and trampled bush pointed to recent human presence, making him feel wary. Nevertheless, he kept pace, determined to follow the foxes to their destination. Mr. Johnson tried to shake off his apprehension, but the fact that this area had signs of recent human activity struck him as unusual. He couldn't recall anyone mentioning plans to come this far into the woods. The broken branches and trampled plants looked fresh, which only added to his growing sense of unease. However, the presence of the foxes kept him moving forward, following closely behind their lead. As he advanced, Mr. Johnson's apprehension grew. The deeper they ventured, the more he felt that uncovering the fox's intentions was crucial. Despite the unease gnawing at him, he couldn't afford to turn back now. He had come too far, and something told him that the destination would provide the answers he sought. Determined to see this through, he pressed on, following the foxes deeper into the mysterious woods. After what felt like hours of navigating through dense thickets and crossing a shallow stream, Mr. Johnson and the foxes reached a clearing. The sudden openness of the area was a stark contrast to the tangled forest they had just traversed. The air felt lighter, but the sense of anticipation grew stronger. He wondered what could be so important that the foxes would lead him to this remote spot. In the middle of the clearing, Mr. Johnson spotted a worn-down, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been left untouched for years, with age and neglect showing in every weathered plank and rusty hinge. This wasn't a place he recalled seeing during his walks through the woods. He squinted, trying to make out details of the structure, feeling a mix of curiosity and caution as the foxes watched him. The foxes paused at the edge of the clearing, almost reverently. It was as if they respected the space they had brought Mr. Johnson to. The animals sat quietly, their eyes fixed on the cabin, waiting for him to make the next move. Their behavior was unusually calm, a stark contrast to their earlier urgency. Mr. Johnson felt the weight of the moment, understanding that he was at a pivotal point in this strange journey. Hesitating for just a moment, Mr. Johnson approached the cabin cautiously. The air around him seemed thick with anticipation, making each step feel deliberate and significant. Whatever lay inside or around the cabin was key to understanding the fox's actions. He moved carefully, each footfall echoing lightly in the quiet clearing. His eyes scanned the surroundings, alert and wary of any unexpected developments as he drew closer to the structure. The foxes sat, watching him intently as he approached the cabin. Their eyes followed his every movement, almost as if they were silently willing him forward. Mr. Johnson could sense their expectation, heightening his own sense of urgency. He knew that whatever secret this place held, it was vital to understanding the fox's persistence. Taking a deep breath, he gathered his resolve and continued his cautious approach. He circled the cabin, looking for signs of why the foxes had led him here. The structure was small and decayed, with missing shingles and a sagging porch. He noted broken windows and an overgrown pathway leading to the door. Mr. Johnson scanned the area, looking for anything that might give him a clue. All the while, the foxes remained at the edge of the clearing, their eyes never leaving him. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, emitting an unpleasant smell that reached Mr. Johnson's nostrils. The scent was musty and slightly metallic, causing him to wrinkle his nose in discomfort. He hesitated momentarily, debating whether or not to enter the cabin. The fox's persistent stares urged him forward. With cautious determination, he pushed the door open, bracing himself for what he might find inside the old, decrepit structure. Pushing the door open, Mr. Johnson was met with an old, decaying interior. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. The decayed state of the cabin was apparent, with broken furniture and debris littering the floor. However, it was the larger, more disturbing elements on the ground that caught his attention. The sight made his stomach churn as he stepped further inside, driven by curiosity. A large broken trap caught his attention in the center of the room. The metal jaws were rusted, yet formidable looking. This wasn't something one casually leaves behind. Mr. Johnson bent down to inspect it closely, wondering what purpose it had served. The sight of it only deepened the mystery. He could tell it was used recently, given the condition of the surroundings and the stories hidden in its rust. Rusted tools and dusty papers were scattered around the room, but a soft moaning sound drew him in further. He carefully stepped over the debris, heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. The unsettling noises were faint yet persistent, echoing in the otherwise silent cabin. As he moved closer, the sound grew louder, making each step feel heavier. He knew he was getting closer to discovering the source of the noise. In a corner, Mr. Johnson found a young fox with its leg caught in a brutal metal trap. The sight was heartbreaking. The fox's eyes were wide with pain and its body trembled. In that moment of realization, everything clicked for Mr. Johnson. This was why the other foxes had been so desperate to get his attention. The young fox's suffering was unbearable to watch, urging him into immediate action. The fox was in agony, whimpering softly as Mr. Johnson approached. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its leg looked horrifically mangled by the trap's cruel teeth. He winced at the sight of raw flesh and bone. The little creature's suffering was a sharp tug at his heartstrings. With every whimpered cry, his resolve to help solidified. He knew he had to act quickly to relieve its pain. Mr. Johnson sank to his knees and carefully pried open the trap. The mechanism was rusty and stiff, making the task challenging. His hands trembled slightly, but his determination didn't waver. Every inch he managed to open brought a mix of relief and urgency. The fox's whimpers grew softer, sensing his efforts. Slowly, he worked the jaws of the trap apart, aiming to free the tortured leg without causing further injury. He finally released the fox's mangled leg, feeling a surge of anger at the deliberate setup. The metal trap clanged shut on the wooden floor, and the fox looked up at him, eyes grateful but weak. The damage was severe. It was painfully clear that someone had set these traps on purpose. His temper flared, thinking about the cruelty involved. He gently lifted the fox, feeling its trembling body against his hands. Carrying the injured fox outside, Mr. Johnson noticed the waiting group of foxes easing up slightly. Their frantic energy seemed to subside as he stepped out of the cabin. The collective relief was almost palpable. The group of foxes watched intently, their eyes following his every move. He felt a strange connection, understanding that their mission was not just about the injured fox, but something much larger at play. They appeared visibly relieved as he stepped out with the injured animal. The foxes no longer darted around. Instead, they formed a protective circle, watching him carefully. Their behavior seemed almost orchestrated, each movement deliberate. Mr. Johnson placed the injured fox gently on the ground, wondering what to do next. A sense of accomplishment flooded him, but questions about the traps and their purpose remained unanswered. Mr. Johnson re-examined the area, trying to understand the significance of what he found. He looked back at the cabin and then at the injured fox, pondering what these discoveries meant. The trap seemed out of place in such a remote location. His mind raced, connecting the dots between the fox's behavior and the deliberate cruelty of the traps. Realizing the urgency for more answers, he couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling. Still unsettled, Mr. Johnson began thinking about contacting the authorities. What he had found wasn't just a random act, it was deliberate and cruel. He weighed his options, considering the best course of action. The foxes had guided him this far, and now it was his turn to take responsible steps. Dialing the local animal control seemed like the first logical step. He needed to ensure the safety of the remaining foxes. Reaching into his pocket, Mr. Johnson pulled out his phone to call animal control. His hands were still slightly trembling from the adrenaline of freeing the young fox. He dialed the number, wanting to ensure that the injured animal would get the medical attention it needed. Looking around, he felt the weight of responsibility. He knew that this call was just the first step in addressing a larger issue at hand. While dialing, Mr. Johnson noticed more traps hidden in the brush around the cabin. The sight filled him with rage and confusion. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to set these traps and inflict pain on the foxes. He scanned the area, spotting rusty metal devices concealed under leaves and twigs. The cruelty of it all was overwhelming. His resolve to put an end to this cruelty strengthened with every new trap he found. Mr. Johnson examined the traps more closely. As he investigated, he discovered evidence linking the traps to a local farmer. There were distinctive marks and signs that he recognized. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He knew who was behind these cruel devices. The sense of betrayal was immense. This was someone he considered a neighbor. This deepened his determination to confront the responsible party and seek justice. With the evidence in hand, Mr. Johnson realized that the farmer had been maliciously targeting the foxes. It wasn't just random trapping, it was a deliberate, cruel campaign against these animals. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The traps were set with precision, intended to maim or kill. This was premeditated cruelty. Understanding the true extent of the farmer's actions made his blood boil. Understanding the cruel intent behind these traps, Mr. Johnson made a mental note to confront the farmer later. His anger was palpable, and he knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. For now, ensuring the injured fox received immediate help was his priority. However, the confrontation would come soon enough. He wasn't about to let these acts of cruelty slide. He had to protect the foxes and hold the guilty party accountable. At that moment, Mr. Johnson comprehended the fox's desperate actions to lead him to their suffering young. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. They had been trying to guide him to the traps, seeking his help. Realizing this, he felt a deep responsibility to assist them. The fox's persistence now made perfect sense. They needed someone to put a stop to the malicious traps and save their young from further harm. Mr. Johnson vowed to take action against the farmer's cruel practices. This wasn't just about one injured fox, it was about preventing future harm. The foxes had shown incredible resilience and intelligence in seeking his help. Now it was his turn to act. He made a silent promise to himself and the animals that he would do everything in his power to stop the cruelty. The sense of duty filled him with newfound purpose. Mr. Johnson provided the distressed foxes with needed help, feeling an intense responsibility weighing on him. He made sure the injured fox was comfortable and safe until animal control arrived. The other foxes watched closely, their eyes reflecting a mix of trust and gratitude. The bond formed over these past few weeks deepened. This wasn't just an obligation anymore, it was a calling to protect and support them. Returning to his farm, Mr. Johnson began planning the next steps to prevent further cruelty. He considered contacting local authorities and rallying the community to address the issue. Every action he planned was a step towards ensuring these traps were removed and enforcing stricter rules against such cruelty. He realized that exposing the responsible party wasn't enough. He needed to create a safer environment for the foxes and other wildlife. Resolved and determined, Mr. Johnson prepared to confront the farmer and protect the foxes. He knew it would be a difficult conversation, but it was necessary. The well-being of the foxes depended on it. He gathered the evidence he had found, ready to present it. Every plan he made revolved around putting an end to these cruel practices. His resolve was unshakable. He was determined to make a difference.